I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Manitoba Craft Council. My name is Crystal Nicklick, and I've been a board member of the Manitoba Craft Council since November 2011. So we would like to thank the Manitoba Arts Council for their generous funding support, without which the Craft Talk series would not be possible, along with the ongoing support from the Department of Culture, Heritage, Tourism, specifically the Arts Branch. I would also like to thank the School of Art at the University of Manitoba for their support in offering this space for the lecture. Our next event is Wednesday, March 20th at 7 p.m. at the Manitoba Crafts Museum and Library, and everyone is invited to attend the reflection of ethnographic textile performance artist Nika Feldman, who will present on the evolution of her work in embroidery, printing, dyeing, and clothing salvage through the lens of a nomadic lifestyle that has taken her to Japan, India, Nepal, Mongolia, USA, and Canada. So I would like to welcome Dr. Ann Steggles, who is both the Associate Director of the School of Fine Arts at the University of Manitoba, as well as a Professor of Art History. Ann has a history rich in the ceramic field. As a descendant of a potter in Oklahoma, and later herself a maker of ceramic objects through her self-established Maple Grove Pottery in Manitoba, it only makes sense for her interest in investigating the current state of ceramics in Canada to be fueled through her love and working knowledge of clay. Ann has a history rich in awards, publications, and teaching excellence. She recently presented 2 talks at the first European Wood-Firing Conference in Royland, Germany, and in 2010 received a Manitoba Arts Council grant to assist her in curating an exhibition of Canadian wood-fired ceramics. Her latest research has been for the preparation of Women and the Flame, an exhibition of wood-fired ceramics slated to open at the Portage and District Arts Center in 2013. Based on her collected knowledge, Dr. Ann Steggles' presentation today will focus on the significant decline of interest in pursuing a full-time career in functional ceramics and the question of, is there a next generation? Okay, so now I'd like to welcome again and introduce Ann Steggles, Dr. Ann Steggles.
It's very nice to see so many people out and about after a long day at work. I know where some of you have been. And I have some thank yous in a minute. I promised Robin Hopper in Victoria, BC, that I would take this so he could hear the recording. He's going to actually test my accuracy. So here we go. We will see if it works. This is why they call art history art in the dark. It's so you can see the images. I've sort of varied my title a little bit from what Crystal said to you. We're going to have a conversation, so I hope at the end of my talk you will feel free to ask questions, to make comments, or to challenge anything that I have said. So I've entitled this a conversation. Where have all the potters gone? And I'm sorry, I can't sing. But some of you can get a tune in your head, maybe with an alt song over that. The subtitle is with the 257 potters out of 300 who answered my questionnaire. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later, and you. I have to put a disclaimer in here. Because I am the Associate Director of the school and because I am a professor here, I would like to say that the views that I express tonight do not reflect on the director. In fact, he has no idea what I'm going to say. He's been trying to find out. I haven't told him. Okay. They also do not reflect those of the school or any of its employees, perhaps. So it's a complete disclaimer. And Remo thought that I should say what is said in the room stays in the room. It's like going to Las Vegas. What happens there stays in Las Vegas. Okay, so that's my disclaimer. I have some people to thank first, just like Crystal. I would like to first thank Tammy Sutherland and the Manitoba Crafts Council, one for the excellent work they've been doing for the last few years, and for actually inviting me to give a talk. I was very humbled. Remo Memorial is here. I would like to thank him because some of the images of Irish Flynn he supplied, even though Irish didn't want you to see them. Iris and Lucia Flynn, also Ruth and Anna Scott, Tony Purnell, Robin Grasshopper Hopper sitting in Victoria, Steve Harrison and Janine King from Australia, members of the Australian Potters Association, Robin DuPont, who is here. Robin took it upon himself to send out my questionnaire to more than the 300 people that I had, and I had literally an inbox full. So thank you, Robin. It was very helpful. To everyone who answered my questionnaire, which went from Europe to New Zealand to Australia to different parts of the United States, Japan, and England. And last but not least, Valerie Metcalfe has no idea, but about 2 years ago, maybe even 3, I had a student by the name of Louise Gardner, and she decided to study with Valerie at mostly stoneware on cordon. There was a conversation between Louise Gardner and Valerie Metcalfe that struck a real soft spot in my heart, and Valerie mentioned to Louise that she was very, very concerned. Where are all the young people, and why aren't they going into functional ceramics? So Valerie, this research, this talk really is for you. Thank you. I always tell my students that they need to know the perspective of the person who writes the newspaper article that they're reading, who happens to maybe write the textbook. It informs them a lot better. So before I continue on, I have to tell you that I am a lover of functional ceramics from the bottom of my heel and little toe up to the top of my head. In part, it was because of this man. John Reeve died last June. I know that he was a teacher of Alan Lakovetsky's. I met John Reeve at Sheridan along with Michael Cardew in the 1970s. And wow, did he love pots. This is a great picture. He had been the business manager and had been an apprentice at the Leach studios in Cornwall, England. And he had also brought to his students at Sheridan, he complains, there's a book I will recommend to you, that he had to make 100 mugs or bowls a day, and that at the end of 6 weeks, he hadn't kept any of them. They had all been smashed. It made him furious as a young man, but later on, he discovered the worth of doing that. So at Sheridan College, that was exactly what he had us do. You would work all day with very fine porcelain, so proud that you could actually throw something this high, and then he'd come along and say, smash it, and you would, and you'd toss it away. So we practiced on big jars like this. The other person that I have to thank is Paul Salner. John Reeve wrote a letter to him, and I consequently spent 5 summers in Aspen, Colorado with Paul and Jenny Salner. The one thing that I loved about Paul was he said, if I knew how it would turn out, I would never bother. And working with him was a delight. Every minute was something new. And that is the studio in Aspen, Colorado. He's one of the earliest people that I know that cast concrete and worked on solar panels. Ruth McKinley was still alive when I was at Sheridan. My gosh, it's a long time ago. And when the wood kiln was firing and the chimney wouldn't pull any of the heat up and the pots were as ugly as you could ever imagine, we were all afraid to go over and ask her how to fix it. But we all loved her work. Tony Purnell. How many people in here know Tony Purnell or have heard of Tony Purnell? Oh, I see. Whoa, I see a few. Yes. The New Ceramics Monthly has an article by one of his apprentices. Tony Purnell and Robin Hopper sent me cartoons, and every morning when I was doing research and preparing for this talk, it was a surprise to see what was in my inbox. So a couple of those illustrations have made their way up here. Tony Purnell opened his heart to me and his wife Sheila to explain to me why the potteries in the Niagara Greenbelt were dying. So we'll talk about that. His work is amazing. He has bought into the oldest studio pottery production house in Canada at Almer, Ontario, 65 years this summer. How many people know Robin Hopper? Ah, good. How many people were at mostly stoneware in the 1970s when Robin Hopper gave his first workshop in Winnipeg? He's amazing. He's a fabulous teacher. He no longer makes functional wear, but he goes out into the studio every day, and Robin Hopper has some really serious concerns about the topic of this evening. Right, there he is. And some of you may know mocha diffusion very well. It was a style of glazing that he worked on in the 70s, and his new red pork bowls. I have no idea. I suspect that no one in here has heard of Steve Harrison unless they're, unless they're a wood-firing fanatic. That was going to be the thing. Steve Harrison talks to living in the slow lane. He's from Australia. I happen to own this bowl, and the clay, or the substance that he used to make that bowl, came from washing gravel for 4 days. It literally is the slow lane. There's his studio. He's a little bit like Paul Saldner. He's a real advocate for eco-living, and another one of his tea bowls. Well, I see a few of you in here, so I want to take you back a little bit in time to reflect on a period of time when we wouldn't have asked where all the potters were. In the 1960s and 70s, some of you may remember what I call the Back to the Land movement. People were buying small pieces of property all over Canada, all over the United States. They were raising their own food. They were having big gardens. I had a friend from Norway who was collecting German Shepherd hair because she was weaving it, and she made hats out in Rose Isle, Manitoba. Really was the hippies, the counterculture, if you like. People were actually experimenting with 6-inch walls for houses and rooms that could be heated by a candle. There was a perception that there was a deterioration happening in the cities and that the air and water was polluted. People read Thoreau, Farley Mowat. I think a lot of people probably still have their Mother Earth News or Whole Earth catalogs tucked away somewhere in a closet. It was an entirely different time and a different way of viewing the world. I called it rural simplicity. I wound up on 15 acres, a city girl, and I wound up living in rural Manitoba. The trend to the Back to the Land movement was so large that in the United States they actually registered it on the census and the demographics. The reasons for it may have to do with science and industry and us old hippies and our long dresses with dandelions woven in our hair, confronting what was happening. I like to think that we might have been following what was happening in Japan in 1955 when the people who were potters, Shoji Hamada was one of those, actually began to question the value and the impact of the industrialized world. So Japan came up with something called the National Living Treasure and there was a return to the handmade and the simple. I like to think of it a return to life on a human scale. Yeah. During that time period, vessels, handmade lasagna pots, mugs, they were just a very intimate part of everybody's life that I knew. If we couldn't buy it, we traded. Everybody was bartering. And you could not buy crunchy granola in a box. You made it. What a concept. It was really good, too. In Manitoba, in 1962, some of you may remember Jack Schurz, who opened up the Studio Pottery on Portage Avenue. As far as Charlie Scott and I could research, that was the first studio pottery in the city. Jack Schurz, now in Regina, Saskatchewan, built the city's first gas kiln, 1962. My gosh, that was a long time ago. Some of you may be familiar with some of these other names that joined Jack Schurz. Tam Irving went on to teach at Emily Carr. Anna Marie Schmidt-Eisler went to Calgary. Muriel Guest found her place at Archie Bray. Jason, and I cannot say his last name, but I hope it's Carr, and if I've messed it all up, I apologize, is in Quebec, still causing trouble. Jerry Tillepaugh eventually bought the studio from Jack Schurz. That group of people produced 9 to 10 stoneware, functional ware. And they were, in fact, in the 1960s, artistically and financially secure. A late image that I have borrowed from a new book, which we'll talk about later, of Tam Irving and his pots. He liked to talk about the inherent beauty in simple objects. Muriel Guest also, very, very simple, undecorated surfaces. And this character here, who thinks we could change society one free thinker at a time, I think we need it. He talks about the simple life. This is a newspaper article from a year ago. I don't think any of us went to the old school of art, though. It was in the law courts building. Think about this. Ceramics was on the 3rd floor. Yeah. Okay, if we go up one more floor. The rooms were all tiny, like houses of the time, and the clay in one single kiln that belonged to the school was in the basement. So there was no elevator, by the way. Okay, so you got fit really quickly, up and down it would go. What a place to have worked. In 1962, some of you may know this, Richard Williams, the director at the time, hires a man by the name of Ron Burke. And this sort of sounds like a swinging door, if I actually, get into the history of it. Burke stays for 2 years. He's a functional potter. He leaves in 1964, and Charlie Scott arrives. At that time, the school actually moves out to the Fort Garry campus. Robert Archambault is going to arrive in 1968. 5 years later, Charlie Scott's going to move to Preston, Ontario to open up his own studio, and when he leaves, Robert Irish Flynn arrives. Charlie Scott will in fact return to be the director of the school for a 5-year period and work in the design area, but not in ceramics. Thanks to Anna Scott and Ruth Scott, I found some early images. People used to throw in dress shirts with ties. Sitting here going, oh my gosh, I didn't believe it. So here is, for those of you that knew Charlie Scott when he looked like, yes, Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead. In fact, I saw an image on Time magazine when Garcia died and wondered why Charlie was on the cover, right? He was a little woolly, wasn't he? Here he is, a little cleaned up and a little bit older than that, but before he got here. Some of you still see Robert Archambault on a daily basis, Professor Emeritus, recent show at the WAG, a couple of his images. And I think retirement has worked really well for Irish. Here he is in Montana. He makes fly rods. He looks for different types of glazed material every time he goes out fishing. And when I saw this image that Remo had provided, I looked at him and, my gosh, he looks 20 years younger than when he left. There has to be a secret in retirement. Or maybe it's Montana. I don't know. And those are the types of vessels that Irish is making right now. Ceramics classes were absolutely full. They were, in fact, chock-a-block full. And I have a quote. In 1987, Charlie Scott and I wrote the vessel's component for a celebration at the WAG. And Scott wrote, "The work that was created in Manitoba displayed a variety of approaches full of self-expression through the simple medium of the vessel. They were of high quality, lively, and aesthetically satisfying. Flynn and Archambault established the ceramics programs at the School of Art. It was one of the most respected in North America." Charlie wrote that in 1987. We actually had students coming all over from North America. And I like to remember that the number of majors vied with that with painting, because I was always hoping they'd get just a little ahead of that. Just about this time, the Manitoba Craft Council is being founded. Some of you know my very dear friend Dwayne Perkins. He came from Chicago in 1969. He studied in Minneapolis, and he opened up Euphoria Stoneware on Marion Street with Ken Chernovich and Steve Jorgensen. Some of you, I hope, still know Kirk Creed. He was with John Waddell at Mostly Stoneware. He is up in Woodlands, Manitoba, with a wood kiln now. Dwayne and Kirk were two of the potters that helped found the early Manitoba Craft Council in 1974. And then I began to think about all of the places, some of them that exist now and some of them that don't, that helped fuel and help studio ceramics grow. Mostly Stoneware eventually became the cooperative that Valerie Metcalfe is part of today on Cordon Street. The Symposium with Wayne Breckner had classes. The Crafts Guild of Manitoba had ceramics classes. There was a huge growth in rural art associations who also had ceramics classes. Alvin Poles had the Sounding Stone on Osborne Street. And some of you may still remember Bonnie McQueen from St. Lucasen and Denise Miller and Judy Marchand from Brandon. Yes, and the Forum Art Institute was in there too. And there will probably be, and Steve Ricca. There's going to be people that I missed. It's huge, okay, the history of ceramics here in the city. How many people went to Calgary? Anybody in here ever traveled that 16 hours from Winnipeg to Calgary? Wow. I won't tell you what happened to me and Dwayne on that trip one time, but my goodness, some of the, I would call them the makers and shapers of the ceramic world, were invited by the Leisure Club in Calgary to put on workshops. So again, 16 hours, it was something that everybody did all the time. Robin Hawker even told me that he participated 3 or 4 years in a row, and then all of a sudden, it just simply fizzled out. So, I'm back to this question. After that brief history, which doesn't cover everybody, we're in fact have all of the potters gone. Well, there are some threats. One of the things, and I'll take you back so you don't get caught up reading that. One of the things that I wanted to do was to find out across the world if potters were still able to make a living. If they were able to support themselves by only producing functional ceramics, or did they in fact have to take workshops, other jobs in order to support themselves and or their families. It's a really tricky question to ask. But then when I said, well, what is it that's threatening your livelihood? It was like literally knocking a dam down, and I was besieged every day. Like I said, Robin Hopper and Tony Purnell wrote me every morning. But other people that I didn't know became friends. Thank goodness for the internet. And they began to paint a picture that was in some ways very sad. I don't want this talk to go there, but there is some things that are happening. There is, of course, what I call the attitude. I don't like to talk about fine art and craft divided. But Scott Watson, when he was accepting the position of the Director of Fine Arts at UBC in 1969, and this is a while ago, was told, just don't show any pots. What a concept. Scott Watson notes that 8 or 9 years later, the tide began to turn back towards what he calls a celebration of craft. Well, there are things that hurt sales in Canada, and I've listed some of them here, but this reflects a 2-month period that I spent poking around southern Ontario, talking to people in wood firing, and trying to find out what was happening. And the first person to open up their heart was Tony and Sheila Flynn, persons. And so they said, you know, they're right across from the United States. They're in one of the most beautiful parts of Canada. There's wineries all around. But some things happened. The implementation of the passport. I don't know how many people in here realize that if you lived close to the U.S. border, and I'm trying to get some more light in here without turning the lights. There. That this would have an impact on your life. But what used to happen was Americans would come across the border. They would bring their children. They would go through the Niagara Greenbelt. They could stop at the wineries. They'd stop at the potteries and buy pots. They'd go see the falls on the Canadian side, and they'd go back home. Well, things really changed. Probably the first thing that happened was 9/11 and all the border security that complicated things. But in the year 2008, there was the implementation both by Canada and the US for passports or documentation on who people were. The passports in the United States are for 10 years. They're expensive. If you have to pay for 2 children, that's also expensive. And Tony and Sheila Flynn said people just weren't coming across anymore to go to the wineries and buy ceramics. The other thing that happened was the Canadian dollar went to par with the US dollar. Does anybody in here remember when the Canadian dollar was worth about 79 cents? Along with me. Yeah. And it was, in fact, an incentive to buy Canadian. The rise in the price of petrol didn't help. And the recession and the stock market crash in 2008 was, in fact, another factor. I brought in 2 quotes from people. This is from a woman who we will see her work in a minute. She said, "I used to earn more 20 years ago at craft fairs than I do now. The day after 9/11, my sales in stores decreased by 3/4 of what they were the day before, and they have not recovered. I have a gallery now to try to improve my income and am involved in a local 12-month studio tour to help out. But it's sure tough times. The prices I can get for my work has not really changed over the past 20 years, but my expenses have dramatically increased. My kiln used to cost $120 to fire, and now it's $500. I am seriously thinking of doing Cone 6 electric. I am very grateful for my weekly teaching job for the income and feel so lucky that I enjoy teaching so very much." That person lives in British Columbia. Well, we're not going to talk about this tonight, but we could be here for a few hours. But Robin Hopper actually believes that the problem with studio ceramics began in the 1960s, when in fact schools of art were placed within the university system. And he also pokes at himself because he taught in that system. And this is reflecting back on it. But he certainly believes it has an impact on the quality of the work that's come out. A lot of the people that wrote me were from Australia and New Zealand. I call it the problem of the importation of the 3 C's. Cheap Chinese ceramics bankrupted half of the studio potters that worked in New Zealand. And that was 2008, that free trade agreement was brought in with New Zealand and China. The closure of ceramics departments in Australia and the move towards design. The studio potters are they're virulent, they're angry about what is happening. The National University in Australia still has, in fact, a ceramics department, but some of the others are closing just as fast as they can get the sign off the door. The constant complaint that I heard from people in Australia and New Zealand was that young persons are not willing to put in the requisite time and training to actually create quality studio ceramics. In fact, they call them the electronic digital age kids. But, and I showed this to my students the other day in my Chinese class, the EU fought back. They were not going to have this flood of Chinese ceramics coming in. And if anybody looks at Jing Dezhen with some kind of admiration, we have to begin asking actually what is happening and what's the impact of that on studio potters all over the world. The EU Commission levied a 58.8% duty on Chinese ceramics so that it would not, in fact, ruin the work that their people were making. And this is from Tony Purnell. One morning I opened up my computer and he said, "Well, you know, it's really easy." He said, "Yeah, this is what it's like. Just keep it spinning, squish it a little bit, and then get over and open an Etsy account and sell it as fast as you can." I could hear him laughing, you know, over those wires, but it's true. And this is Robin Hopper's and Tony Purnell's great thing that they're poking at these days. NASDAD, I will say the word. We don't own this thing. It's a Dutch kiln. NASDAD thought this was going to be the future of ceramics. You can't see the flame. The computer fires the pots. You never get to touch them. Now, what somebody didn't tell NASCAP was that potters are pyromaniacs. You know, like we love getting dirty and smelly with wood. If it breaks, they have to bring the technicians in from Holland to fix it. But you know what? The real problem is if you graduate from a school and you've been using equipment like this and you don't learn how to fire it, you know, what are you going to do when you graduate? You know, it's a serious problem. You never seen the flame on a gas kiln? Never almost blown yourself up? Oh, that's all the fun. There. So, let me repeat this. The things that have threatened everybody have been cheap Chinese imports, a lack of sufficient training opportunities, and when I think of Irish Flynn, I had a tiny little conversation with Remo earlier. It just gets darker and darker. I can turn the lights on, but they're going to be really bright. People who used to enroll in ceramics had this kind of grimace look on their face because Irish would say, you know what, if you're going to take ceramics, you're going to be in here 39 hours a week. There was no question. If you didn't do it, he would eat you alive, okay? The fact was he was right. If you paint, you need to be painting. If you're making pots, you need to be in there. Making pots is like playing on a piano. You can't take one lesson and go home and make a dinnerware set. Doesn't work that way. The closure of ceramic units is another threat. I would also like to add that high school art programs without ceramics areas are not causing anyone to be interested so much.
And they shut down all the city-run ceramic programs too.
Yes.
They shut 2 places down while I was working.
Right. Yeah, they're closing all over the place. I'm sorry. For any of you that feel that you're a hobbyist, one of the biggest issues has to do with people who are really trying to make a living and their students go out and all they want to do is pay for their clay, so they'll charge $2 for a mug. You know, seriously, it costs more. Okay, wait, you're really good. Sell them for what they're worth then. Cutbacks in government grants. Every time I turn around, the Manitoba Arts Council was being cut, so was the Canada Council. Rising costs. I built my salt kiln for $3,500, and it was huge. I figured it would cost anywhere between $12,000 and $15,000 now to do that. The price of having land in the countryside, you can burn all this wood and pollute the air with all that salt is higher. And the need to make a living, it scares people. They'll think twice. They think they may not be able to do it. But there are some people who are beating the odds. There are some people that you know, and I'm going to introduce you to a few because I don't want this to turn out to be one of those crying in the napkin things. We had 2 potters a couple of weeks ago that the Ceramics Club invited, and I noted also with them the same thing that came across the world. I call it the 3 W's, working really hard. You have to be prepared to be in the studio as much as 17 or 18 hours a day, creating quality work. The other is getting yourself out there through workshops and engaging with people who would be potential patrons. Very, very important. And you know what? 25 years ago, we didn't have websites, but everybody seems to have a website, and I can't push it any further. Website, website, website. So I'm going to introduce you to a few people. Most of them are close to my heart for one reason or another. Thomas Akins and his partner, Katie Hyde, collaborate. Thomas throws the porcelain, it's cone-tin porcelain, and Katie decorates it or paints it. She also works in sculpture. Thomas and I often have breakfast together. In fact, I can't think of anything better than pulling out a mug or a bowl made by a friend and sitting there, because it's absolutely true. It isn't the thing, it becomes the person that made it. So Thomas Aikens is from Ontario. Robin, I'm sorry, I hope I don't embarrass you. I discovered Robin a few years ago when I was researching wood firing for the Braun Talk in Germany. This is one of Robin's recent teapots. Like Thomas Aikens and Katie Hyde, they're young. You know, they've got energy and they show great promise. Don't know how many of you know Hanun Lin, but you can read the newspaper through her porcelain, which is something that John Reeve would have liked very much. Cam Fisher, another wood-fired potter from Woodstock, Ontario. This is his kiln. He sells work and shows work all over the world and has an amazing website. Jane Harold. Jane Harold worked with Michael Cardew. She owns a studio in Palisades, New York, but she has actually bought land on Cape Breton Island. I thought she'd lost her mind when she told me. She decided that what she wanted to do was build a beehive wood-fired kiln on Cape Breton and bring back to life the village potter. She's been working in Cape Breton back and forth between Palisades, New York for the past 3 years. And she makes dinnerware. Yeah, oops. Yeah, it's beautiful. Cathy Jefferson from Duncan, BC is, the quote that I read is from her. She said that she made more 20 years ago than she does now, but she loves where she lives. Imagine living in a place like this where you can look up at these huge trees. She's still hanging on, and it's the teaching that's helping her, and she's looking forward to seeing what her website can do. This is the work that she makes. It's gorgeous. And it looks, there's vases, and if you do go to her website, they soar up, just like the beautiful nature that exists in BC. Yeah. And here's another one. I just went, oh, I want to touch them. No. But I think all of us would like to work in Cathy's studio. Wow. Wake up in the morning and go outside and look at this. Yeah. Maybe we'll all move to DC. She also has a gallery. And one of the common things of Thomas Aikens and Cam Fisher, Cathy, and a few others is that they either have a gallery in their studio or they actually have a very, very good gallery or shop that handles their work. Anybody in here heard of Judith Duff? She is an expert on North and South Carolina groundhog hills, and her accent is worse than mine. Judith Duff is one of the most successful potters that I know. She fires with wood. Here's one of her tea bowls. That's her train kiln. In fact, this is her kiln shed. It's massive. She gives pottery workshops. She travels the world lecturing on the history of groundhog kilns, and she makes sure that every person that she comes in contact with has one of her business cards. She also has a website. What she wanted to do more than anything was to see if she could make a chignon glaze, which is, I call it a fat white, like the Japanese do, with materials that she found on her own property. And she did. She got huge grants from the U.S. government. Yeah. And there she is. The problem with Judith Duff is she doesn't know anyone as energetic as her to take over, and Judith Duff is getting to be what she calls an elderly senior citizen. She is a little over 70 now. Yeah. I met Karina Reinhardt in Germany, and these are two of her pieces. This one is about, I apologize, I deal in inches most of the time, about 6 inches high, and this one is about 9. Karina Reinhardt lives in a part of Germany that was at one time East Germany. And the East Germans couldn't buy televisions and all kinds of electronics, but they had lots of money. So the Reinhardt pottery, whenever they opened up their kiln, people would literally line up and it would all be sold. They were able to establish such a reputation, they're up on the Baltic Sea at the corner of Poland and Germany, that they still today have that type of reputation. They make it and it's sold and gone. They deal in salt-fired stoneware and they fire it with wood. My friend Marcus Bohm lives very, very close to the Reinhardts. He lives at Altgarth, and he decided that he was going to make it as a potter. They bought property on a lake, him and his wife, and they set up cottages for bed and breakfast. They offer studio workshops, they offer kiln building workshops, and some of the makers and shakers of the wood-firing world come there. Some of you may know Kusakabe Masakazu. He built the Toran kiln that is out in BC. He travels all over the world. In fact, his studio was demolished by the tsunami, and so all of the potters in Germany went together and they found places for him and his friends to live and work while they were rebuilding in Japan. And this is Marcus Bohm. Has a huge wood kiln, invites the likes of Paul Davis and Steve Harrison up to do workshops, and people come from all over the world. Yeah. And at the Brawlin Conference, he decided to make tea for everybody and do calligraphy. So he's quite the character if you've ever met him. He dropped I think it was about a 50-pound kiln shelf on his foot, so he had to sit. And he's not a person that likes to sit, he likes to be active. Yeah. But that day, he could sit there on the wheel and he threw T-ball after T-ball after T-ball. Yeah. And there's some of his work. I was in Japan last year, and the third weekend of October every year, just outside Kyoto, at a place called Yamashina, they have a pottery sale. There are literally hundreds of stalls and tables, and Kusakabe and those potters are doing very well because there has always been a culture that purchased ceramics, and they did it every year and replaced ceramics every year. Anybody in here besides the wood firers know this character named Paul Davis? Oh, holy Dinah, if you ever want to look and bring somebody in for a workshop, he is absolutely amazing. He ran the Strut Workshop in Australia. Right now he's up at Mittagong, and he's got a thing going with the Chinese buying coal that drives him nuts. He travels all over the world to do workshops. He teaches, and this is some of his latest work. He also makes functional ware. I'm almost at the end of this. I doubt if anyone in Manitoba has heard of Pinecroft. But on the 22nd of June, this summer, Pinecroft Studios will celebrate being open for 65 years. It was Tony Clennell's uncle that established this pottery. Tony Clennell and his wife Sheila have sold their studio in Beamsville in the Green Belt because they had no sales. And they have moved up to join Pinecroft. On June the 22nd, 2013, anybody here would be invited. Valdi, I thought he was dead, then I realized he was very pickled, is going to perform. Tony didn't like that when I said that. And there's a lake there, and they're going to have a pickerel fry, and Ron Myers is going to give a workshop. So really, it's going to be interesting there. And this is the studio. They have a bed and breakfast, they have a tea shop, and they're just really hoping that the finances improve here. They're going to give it a go. One of my heroes always, Setsu Yanagi, said, on reflection, one must conclude that in bringing cheap and useful goods to the average household, industrialism has been a service to mankind, but at the cost of the heart, of warmth, of friendliness, and beauty. By contrast, articles well made by hand, though expensive, and you will pay a whole lot more for a mug that Valerie makes than a real cheap Chinese import that every morning you can look at it and have coffee with Valerie, can be used in homes for generations, and thus considered they are not expensive after all. He was, in fact, addressing in 1955 the issues of industrialization. He joined these two amazing men. We look over here, Bernard Leach and Shoji Hamada, in pushing forward the studio pottery movement. I'd like to bring a couple of things to your attention because I think this is hopeful as well. At the Gardner Museum in Toronto, in Queen's Park, until April the 14th, they have a show called Connections, Canadian and British Studio Ceramics. It's amazing. I saw it in the middle of February. It's really, really worth the trip if you can get out there. And I'd like to thank Paul. He didn't realize one day that he had this book that he brought back from a trip to Vancouver called Throne. And in 2004, there was an exhibition, exactly like what the Gardner's doing now, British Columbia's Apprentices of Bernard Leach, which of course included John Reeve and their contemporaries. This book was launched in 2011. It's excellent. And in late 2012, I believe it was the end of November, Michael Cardew, some of you know he went to Africa. He's a British studio tradition. The Last Sane Man, Michael Cardew, was published. It is excellent as well. There. So, besides going to galleries, I have a challenge for some of you. And it's called, So What Can You Do to Help? Now the problem is, I'm speaking to the choir, or the converted, so you're going to have to kind of spread this around. In Australia, they've got something called Adopt a Potter, and this really, really took off and went to England. So what they're doing is founding in 2009, there was a trust set up so that established studio potters would in fact take on some of the younger generation so they would actually be able to get that extra training that they needed. They had a whole bunch of aims. If you want to read about it or if you want to watch a video, just go to Adopt a Potter. It's not a bad idea. Reminds me a little bit of Mama's winter program. But the next time you need mugs, please don't go to IKEA to buy them. I picked up a woman's magazine today, and it was all about minimalism. Not the art style, but rather life. So think, less is more. There was a man by the name of Ananda Coomaraswamy that said we wouldn't have to work so hard at jobs we hate if we simply bought one beautiful thing that we loved instead of buying 50 that we didn't like and had to replace. most of you are very educated. Actually, you're mostly practitioners. But I think the public needs to be educated. I don't know if it's workshops, talks, something. Teach them to understand what quality is. But also, just because it's handmade doesn't mean it's excellent. Figure out quality and support local mentorship projects. There. I think also, I see Monica is here and Robin DuPont. We are very fortunate at the School of Art. We have 2 people that have been nominated for the RBC Emerging Artist Award in Ceramics. The voting begins to take place in September. It's a $10,000 prize. That's going to go a real long ways to helping someone. But I think that we need to do more than that. And I think it's time to write your provincial government, write your MPs, start telling them that we need to celebrate our own treasures. Don't let Japan just have that accolade. I would also like to hope that there's not just one yearly award for one person. And I would also ask that you support excellent mentors who will train apprentices like the Adopt the Potter movement. And again, go online and vote. Be aware of it. I will remind you, RBC Emerging Artist for 2013. Again, I'd like to thank the Arts Council, our Manitoba Craft Council, for inviting me to talk. There is a young woman named Esther Davies living in Nigeria who will benefit from the proceeds from this talk. She actually can pay for 6 months of training. So, thank you very much. Questions or comments? Please.
What kind of questions are on the questionnaire?
Okay. The questions on the questionnaire, and I'm just going to turn off this recording so Robin doesn't get totally bored with this. The first thing that I asked, and I could have read it off to you, was how long had they been working, making, and I wanted to make sure that I had people who were doing what I call functional wear. Okay, I wasn't looking for design, I wasn't looking for sculpture. How long had they been practicing? Had they been able, and these are tricky questions, had they been able to actually make a living and support themselves full time? Or did they have to take on another job or teach or do something? Some people were hesitant about that. And a lot of people, I had a young man in Australia who'd only been working a couple of years to answer the questionnaire. I had another man who had been working in Kyoto 60 years ago. So there was also a range. I wanted to know if they had noticed a decline in their sales. I wanted to know if they had noticed a decline or change in attitudes about functional wear. And then I just let it open and say, what do you attribute this to? And that was when I said the floodgates just opened, especially in Australia and New Zealand. The interesting thing was the potters that are living in Germany are supporting themselves very well. They have no problems. The really odd thing about all of this is, and I have a lot of connections in Australia. There are wood fires, and they're not suffering either. But this whole move also towards design. So I just go crazy, when Jane DeJean, I just go like, oh, it's putting people that I know out of work. So those were the types of questions. And then what would happen is they'd send me the answers, and then they'd say, you know what, I forgot about this. And then we had a dialogue. So I want to travel and meet some of these people now. Most of them sent pictures. They were really heartfelt comments. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes, Charlotte.
I'm sort of expecting you might be commenting on things like shifts in choices students coming into the School of Art make.
Oh, I could go on for days. I would say categorically, that the choice to go in ceramics has declined significantly. From having 30 majors when Bob Archambault and Irish Flynn were here, it used to be 27, 30, somewhere in there. I think last year there were 2. So it's been a huge shift. A lot of that may have to do with a move to design and sculpture as opposed to Bob Archambault and Irish Flynn ran a great pot shop. In fact, I think Grace still struggles over there with the shelves that are the sizes for a regular production shop. Yeah, but yes, choices are changing. We still have, of course, a huge call for painting, but the ceramics has changed. Anything else? Okay, Selena, and then we'll come over to Janice. You.
Okay. So you mentioned that potters in Germany are still doing pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
And then you mentioned that potters who are in Australia are still doing pretty well, but some aren't doing so well.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess could you tell us who's doing well or who's able to maintain their, being a potter and who is like, can you be able to be directly difference? I mean, you talked about it.
With the exception of Steve Harrison, every wood-firing potter that corresponded with me, either in Australia or in Western Europe, has seen a growth in their bottom line. And that's very interesting to me. I'm prone myself. My love and my passion is wood firing. So I was surprised at that. Marcus Bohm is a really good example. Paul Davis is a really good example. But these are people that are literally out there. Their names are known. They travel through Europe. I don't know if you've ever been to Germany, but they have pottery sales. The Dresden pottery sale in October is like nothing I've ever been to. So these are huge sales that people wait for and go to. And I was surprised that it was the wood fires that were doing well. If we come back to Canada, Tony Purnell is a wood fire, not doing well. Okay? Ken Fisher's doing okay. Thomas Aikens, with his porcelain, fired in 09 and 9 to 10, the sort of pastel colors. I almost called it fiesta wear. I love it. It makes me happy every morning when I get out his folds. It's doing really, really well, but he's working hard. He has the right chops. The other thing is galleries. We used to have, my goodness, anybody in here who's around my age will remember that we used to have pottery shops all over. And a lot of them have closed. In fact, I send everybody to mostly stoneware. A lot of the shops are taking anywhere from 50 to 60%. And that's tough. That's really, really tough. So people are selling online. In fact, if you give a workshop, I suggest that you take along several boxes of supplies. People will buy them. It's a way to get your name out there. Yeah. But I was shocked by the wood fires. Most of the ones that are doing as well are firing with doing reduction gas propane. There's a lot of call for lightly decorated pieces like Katie Pine and Corey. Hopefully I'll get 300 or 400 more questionnaires, and then we'll be able to hire a research assistant to sort out all the data for this. That's a good question. At one point in time, there was a talk of clustering. Some people may have heard this. A lot of this happens because there's difficulties with program requirements. It's not as simple as it sounds. We have people, I know Grace is looking at new equipment. Deb Scott in Sculpture is looking at new equipment that would really function more on the design front. I've been talking to Robin DuPont because I think one of the things that we need is actually to have very, very intensive wheel drawing workshops, because that's what I care about, you know. And not for, again, without getting into the politics of the university, it's very difficult to work with summer session. Remember I said, let's stay 7 years stays in here. So it's very hard to get the numbers of students to actually have courses happen. But if we have the offer credit courses, Robin may be having you throwing 8 hours straight if you take that. In fact, I don't know. Yeah, he is. Where, but we've been talking about things like that. What, throwing?
Yeah, it's summer.
Yes, May. Robin, you have 2 eager beavers here. Take their names, Janice and Vera. They will line up to pick anything that you offer them. We're working on all kinds of things. Believe it or not, I think I said to somebody once, universities are slow. They're really slow. By the time we get an idea and get somebody over there to recognize it, it takes a year and a half to get it past through Senate to do it. And then by then you've forgotten you even had one. Robert.
I think there's an interesting dialogue happening between the idea of quality and the idea of making a living. And I often encourage my students to subsidize their work for a period of time. I mean, taking it back to the traditional apprenticeship system, it was 7 or 9 years.
Yes, absolutely.
And thinking of that, like an undergraduate degree is really barely scratching the surface. And I think
that was one of the things Tony and Robin and I had these conversations about the British apprenticeship system. And Valerie, when we had lunch, there was something interesting brought up, because what was happening there is England's still a guild system, and their professional potters were finding that students were selling, flooding the markets with really not high quality, but very, very cheaply priced goods. And the guilds interceded there, and they actually agreed on a pricing structure so that the professional potters were out of that business.
that's a tough one too, because I think it comes down to educating the public.
Yeah.
Having them recognize what a good pot or a good painting is versus or a $1,000 pot versus a $5 pot, $1,000 painting versus a $5 painting.
Yeah, exactly. It takes educating a country, on what is quality. And sometimes you don't know it when you first see it. So I think that's a challenge to all of you, is to really look at quality, support local people. Anyone else? Please.
On a positive note, right now there are 9 fourth-year students working in ceramics. So I'd like to suggest that everybody come to the BBFA show next month, happening in Porcelain.
Excellent. So if you didn't catch that, this is new at the school. I'm really happy about it. All of the people that are graduating with their BFA this year actually are part of a big exhibition, and the school is supporting a catalog for them. So this is the first time. It was Paul's idea. Everybody's welcomed it. It's a lot of hard work to put this together, but it's been almost a sea change. So I'm really, really excited about it. Yes, and some of the people in here are part of that 4th year senior studio group that's graduating this year. So it's a very nice group. Anybody else? Oh.
In defense of painting. I guess what I would say is that I really don't think it's painting versus ceramics or ceramics versus painting. I think the difficulty right now is actually slightly, it's a bit different than that. So let me throw out an idea. And that is that I think that what's happening happened in the last few years, and this is an observation of mine, is that students coming in are very de-skilled. They're de-skilled partly because they have an attitude about what work is that's very different, fundamentally different than the people you're showing us. So that's one cause, I think.
Yeah. Very different
And
work
I think
ethic.
that has a lot of repercussions in a learning institution, but it has an awful lot of resonance in a place where you have to self-select something that's a little more practice-driven as opposed to knowledge-driven. So I think that's a tricky one to pull apart. And I think the other thing is that there's a strong desire on the part of students, although I think it's a bit puzzling to me, to try to work on a variety of musicals. And I think that, you know, if you want to invoke painting or you want to invoke ceramic production, you were describing it, these are sort of solitary things to do. They take a lot of time. We talk a lot about that. But they're not done in collaboration with other people necessarily. And so I think that this idea of working on a bunch of things at once is, it makes it very difficult to understand how to link that to the idea of work, which is where you're sort of seeing it right now. And I think that perhaps if we were less driven by the kind of the reach of social media in relation to these things that I'm putting out, perhaps, you know, maybe what we have is a different notion of how that all this all come together. But I think that de-skilling is really becoming an obstacle for the kinds of values you're talking about and the kinds of things that is reflected in your demonization of these other things.
Well,
I leave them unspoken because I think it's a range that's not, it's not really defined. Like what you are demonizing isn't really, you're not defining, which is a smart move. So I give a lot of credit for just sticking around that one.
Yeah, I slipped around that one.
But it's out there, and you know, not that that's what the topic is. The topic is very different, as Grace said.
But it's,
go to the positive, not the dark side.
but it's very true. And repeatedly, almost everybody that wrote me talked about the idea, the change in attitude, the not having any skills, because all of our programs in the schools have been cut. Students come to university without any, and then because they're required to take English and science and everything.
No, actually, you got it wrong.
Okay.
I'm not pointing the finger in that direction.
No, I'm not saying you are.
I'm backing up to their ideas.
Right.
They arrive with those.
Yeah.
They're not instilled here.
No, I'm not looking here. And I will clarify something, because Paul will not have known this. But years ago, before he arrived, Irish Flynn and Bob Archambault used to duke it out, because the number of majors you had almost established how much funding you were going to get for your little silo. Hence the competition between the painters and the ceramic studio. It was a whole different kind of world than I function in today. You know, and ceramics, we love it. It costs a lot of money to set up a studio. Robin Hopper figures that if you want to go out and set up your own studio with a shop in it now, you need $40,000 in your pocket. You know, it's very, very expensive. So, you know, there's a move. I hope there's a support for co-ops like Valerie has. I know that she's worried about where the young people are that are going to fill all those spaces at mostly stoneware. But that is one way, because you don't have to burden the whole cost of all the kilns and all of the facilities where you're working. Can be expensive. Yes, Erica.
I would like to see more courses that are skill-based, because I had a previous career. And I went
Look at this fellow here. No, that was right. Okay.
And I went back to school. Actually, it was first at Silver Gallery.
Okay.
I always liked pottery, wanted to learn how to do it. Was immediately in love with it. A lot of kiln, bought the wheel, bought the kiln, couldn't do enough. Thought, I'll go to school to learn more. They'll teach me how to do glazes from scratch and all this. Well, that wasn't the case. I mean, I had to really, like in the majors class, I had to really go all out trying to break down, you know, this glaze chemistry. And it was still such a mystery. It was so much, it is a mystery, like a lot of it. And so it is a contemporary art school. It's all conceptual for the most part. But I really wanted someone, you know what, I'll produce 100 chili bowls if that's what you really want to do. But the all just is crappy because I haven't really learned how to go beyond or whatever. I'm just kind of now pumping out.
Robin's going to try to help out with some of that.
Yeah,
in May, so please.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's different.
I come from a music background. I went to school in Regina, and one thing I found was really lacking in the program there, just as a student going out into the world and what do you do now? And as far as career, as far as making yourself known, as far as finding those opportunities and creating those opportunities for yourself. And so I you know, had to do something different because I didn't know what to do from there. And I think something that was lacking from that program, I don't know what classes there are in the art school for students, but as far as business planning, like how do you budget? How do you decide, like, you know, doing co-ops or whatever? Like, I think there needs to be classes, and I don't know if there are, on all of that stuff of where do you go to make that leap from student to making a
To actually
career
practicing
and
arts, yes.
planning your business.
Right, thank you. We've talked about that. I don't know who had their hand. I think it was Elizabeth.
I guess I'm just kind of curious about one's practice. Because I think that, you know, go to university, go to college, you learn a set of skills, and then it's ongoing.
Right.
If you need to teach yourself that part you didn't get, or that class didn't line up with your schedule, and you have to teach yourself that, then that's it. And you keep going. And I think that what I feel often with students is that they want the quick, let's get, okay, get it fast, give you the bottom line, let's get it going. And then there's the other kind of practice that is a lifelong practice. You can't really explain it to someone who has had a much smaller practice. They've got a lot of time ahead of them to work on. But, and it really sort of divides us in the long run. Some of us stick with the practice, and some of us don't.
Right, but there is a certain amount of off the book, right? Close to one thing, but I can see someone grow and learn 10 times more than they're practicing on my own.
I agree with you, but I also know that the pockets of information that were missed somehow along the way can be, I mean, many artists teach themselves a lot of things. That's how they do it. Because they're not always in school.
The Harvard's a little different because you really need somebody who knows what they're doing to show you how to fix or correct certain things. Like Paul said, it's like and you really do need somebody who knows what they're doing to show you how to do practice. This is how to get those schools, how to press the block, how to it's not quite the same as making it art, but it's a little bit more. I'm not saying you can't be just as expressive making art, but there are certain rules that they take college. You know, if there are, if you want to make a quality art, you need to know.
Well, you need a lot of, I'm going to come back and correct you a little bit, Selena. It's almost magic. There was in the 60s, I think, a book called Centering. It was Zen-like, you know, and it really talked about centering yourself. You had to empty your head of everything, and it's magic. The first time you center, you know, and you pull the walls up, and it's not flopping all over the place, and you get it. It's like, I get it. That Valerie may remember this. John Waddell told me that I would never be able to throw pots. My arms were too short. Okay, so all of my pots he took and he literally threw them at the wall and broke them. you know, and it is. It's that practicing and doing. And sometimes somebody will say, oh, this is the only way how to throw a pot. Well, it doesn't work for you. You know, you have to find your own way. The thing I would tell you is just don't have your elbows going out like this, you know. You have to pretend that you're a machine. You know, none of these problems are going to be answered quickly. I'm not even sure that they're that big of problems, but I think they're things that you should be aware of. I mean, I've been in making ceramics or writing about them or curating for years, and I had no idea that passports caused my friend Tony Purnell to literally not have a livelihood. Who in the world would have thought about a change in passports? It didn't even click, you know. So there's a lot of other things kind of in the background. And for all of you that do want to be studio potters, have someone that makes you as mad as John Waddell, Valerie shaking her head, and you'll do fine. Literally, you'll go home and you'll work like crazy. Any other comments? Oh, two more. Okay, Vera.
Besides of a process, what not it can be smaller or
Well, unless you want us to go bankrupt, Vera, they need to be a certain size.
what certain size, not very, not very.
Oh, not for credit, it'll depend on what the costs are. We're not making any money, we just have to trade the costs down. So we'll talk to me and Robin later on, we're working out the details. Okay? So, I don't know. Right now, I don't know, I'm sorry. Selena, you will have the last word.
Okay, this is a question about the impact of pushing MFA programs on products. I mean, do you think that maybe discourages some students from pursuing college? Do you think encouraging students to pursue an MFA after they've actually possibly discouraged students from thinking about doing pottery as a business after they graduate?
I know lots of people who have MFAs who run very successful pottery businesses. In fact, it helps them. Okay, Robin may be able to speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think you take a 4-year degree and you add it to a 3-year MFA, you get a traditional apprenticeship. You spent your 7 years of education that you would have spent either in doing your journeyman, learning plumbing, or any of the traditional trades. And then you're ready to sort of jump into your professional realm, in my opinion. I don't know.
If you're going to run a pottery in the country like I did, you didn't need an MFA.
Sorry, I agree with Robin. I don't do functional. I don't my work. But
Well, that's why I didn't ask you the question.
I know I do MFA was the same thing. It was time to get better at what I do.
Yeah, and it's also to have that attention of someone that you pick to work with. You know, it's really a good idea to pick your mentors carefully.
Kind of a modern equivalent of difference.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah. Unless you're in Japan and it's 20 years. Yeah, you almost have a license. Anyway, I think Tammy has something to say, but thank you for your question. If you have any comments that you want to write to me, you know, that you're thinking about, please feel free. This is the tip of the iceberg on this research project.
Thank you, Marianne. The program coordinator of the Manitoba Craft Council, and I just wanted to thank you all for coming. It's a great group here, and so many faces that I've never seen before, which is exciting for us. The Manitoba Craft Council offers lots of opportunities for emerging and as well as mid and professional level craftspeople, including exhibitions and mentorship and bursary support and as well as just exposure to our website and through exhibitions and shows. So I urge you to get involved. We have pamphlets and lots of catalogs from past shows out in the foyer. We also have lots of snacks. So stay around and please do talk to me. We're always constantly developing new programming. We're always interested in hearing what can address the issues that we're seeing. Everybody brought up. Yeah, so we're keen to generate new ways of working that can be meaningful to people.
Sounds
So
good.
I think believe that's it for tonight. Thank you, Mary Ann, so much for taking the time with us. And
Thank you very
enjoy
much.
the conversation.